Maya Okafor pressed her palms against the reinforced viewport of the Academy shuttle, watching the sprawling structure of Concordia grow larger against the star field. The Academy of Xenological Sciences hung in the gravitational sweet spot between three systems, its bioluminescent towers pulsing with the rhythm of a dozen different atmospheric processors. Real space stations didn't gleam like the holodrama suggested. They were patchwork constructions of necessity, beauty emerging from function rather than design. "First time seeing the Academy?" asked Veldon Chorus 7, the gaseous being, sharing her transport pod. Their voice rippled through the atmospheric mixture like wind through chimes. "Yes," Maya replied, not mentioning that it was her first time off Earth entirely. The other passengers a crystalline sharky, whose faceted body caught starlight like a prism, two reptilian Gekth nobles with their ceremonial scarifications still healing, and a collective of insectoid hive speakers had been traveling between worlds since childhood. To them, interstellar academia was a natural progression. To Maya, it was a miracle she'd even been accepted. The docking procedure took 3 hours due to the complex atmospheric requirements. Maya watched the other students unconsciously segregate themselves by species, their easy familiarity with galactic etiquette making her hyper-aware of her own uncertainty. When the Gekth noble Crick's descending flame, according to his formal introduction deliberately, bumped into her during debarking, she simply stepped aside and murmured an apology. "Careful," he hissed, his translator rendering his words with cold amusement. "Wouldn't want the human to get ... aggressive?" The other students laughed, and Maya smiled politely. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Show them your civilized baby girl. Let them think they know what civilization means." The Academy's interior was a marvel of engineering. Gravity wells adjusted seamlessly between sections. Atmospheric composition shifted to accommodate different species' needs, and the architecture itself seemed to breathe with living walls that filtered toxins and regulated temperature. Maya's assigned dormitory was in the mixed atmosphere section, where the environmental controls worked overtime to maintain livable conditions for incompatible species. Her roommate was Sharky Frost Eternal, whose crystalline form required sub-zero temperatures to maintain structural integrity. The environmental system had divided their shared space down the middle. Maya's side maintained Earth-normal conditions, while Frost Eternal's side was a winter wonderland of ice and ammonia-scented air. "I trust you won't mind the temperature." "Differential," Frost Eternal said, their voice tinkling like breaking glass. "Though I suppose your species is ... table." Maya unpacked her few belongings methodically, ignoring the subtle emphasis on adaptable, galactic code for primitive enough to survive anything. Her possessions looked shabby compared to the other students' belongings. A datapad that was 2 generations out of date, clothing that had been recycled multiple times, and a small recording device containing her grandmother's stories about Earth's ecosystems. The first week passed in a blur of orientation sessions and placement exams. Maya discovered that her primitive education had actually prepared her well. Earth's harsh conditions had taught her to observe, adapt, and survive in ways that the galaxy's privileged students had never needed to learn. She scored in the top percentile on practical assessments, while struggling with the social dynamics that other students navigated effortlessly. The testing wasn't limited to academics. During lab sessions, her equipment would mysteriously malfunction. In the cafeteria, atmospheric adjustments would leave her table's air unbreathable. Her study materials would disappear from her dormitory, only to reappear days later with subtle damage that made them unusable. Maya documented everything in her grandmother's old recording device, speaking in Earth's Cherokee language that the universal translators couldn't parse. She described each incident with clinical detachment, analyzing patterns and cataloging the careful cruelty disguised as accidents and misunderstandings. 3 months into her first term, Maya had established a routine that minimized conflict while maximizing her academic performance. She arrived early to claim functioning equipment, ate alone to avoid atmospheric mishaps, and spent her evenings in the observatory where the environmental controls were too critical to tamper with safely. The other students had settled into, treating her as a curiosity dangerous but contained like a wild animal in a zoo. They would point her out to visiting students, making observations about human resilience and primitive adaptation strategies, as if she couldn't understand their carefully translated insults. Crick's ascending flame had appointed himself as her primary tormentor, though he was far too sophisticated to make it obvious. He would schedule lab equipment during her reserved time slots, cite cultural sensitivity to exclude her from study groups, and make a show of environmental adjustments that left her gasping for properly oxygenated air. "It's fascinating," he would say to his followers, his reptilian features arranging themselves into what passed for scholarly interest. "Observe how the human adapts to adverse conditions. Their homeworld's extreme environment has clearly programmed them for survival." Over-sophistication. Maya would smile and nod, taking notes in her ancient datapad, while the universal translators struggled with her grandmother's stories about Cherokee warriors who won battles by letting their enemies underestimate them. She was learning more about galactic civilization than any textbook could teach specifically. How civilized cruelty operated. The turning point came during a xenobiology presentation. Maya had spent weeks preparing her research on Earth's ecosystem recovery patterns, drawing connections between her grandmother's oral histories and current environmental data. It was groundbreaking work, the first comprehensive study of how Earth's legendary adaptability actually functioned at the biological level. She'd barely begun her presentation when Veldon Chorus 7 accidentally introduced a gaseous compound that was technically non-toxic to humans, but caused severe respiratory distress. Maya pushed through, her voice becoming increasingly strained as she struggled to breathe, while the other students watched with clinical interest. Perhaps the human should take a break, suggested Professor Zenthkar, the cephalopod academic who supervised their cohort. We wouldn't want to push beyond natural limitations. Maya forced herself to remain standing, though her vision was starting to blur. I'm fine to continue, Professor. Humans are adaptable. She completed her presentation while slowly suffocating, her grandmother's voice keeping her focused. When they try to break you, baby girl, you show them what unbreakable looks like. The applause was polite but dismissive. Later, Maya would discover that her presentation had been graded down for obvious respiratory distress that interfered with professional delivery. The incident wasn't reported as harassment. It was classified as a species compatibility issue and filed away. That night, Maya sat in her dormitory recording another entry in Cherokee. Her roommate, Frost Eternal, was deliberately creating ice storms that filled the room with sub-zero precipitation, making it impossible to study without protective gear Maya couldn't afford. This is day 97, Maya whispered to her recording device, her breath visible in the artificial winter. A pattern is escalating. They're becoming more confident, more creative. Crick's is now openly organizing betting pools on what will finally make me demonstrate human aggression. They think they're conducting an experiment. She paused, watching ice crystals form on her datapad screen. Grandmother always said that patience isn't passive. It's active waiting, gathering information, understanding your enemy, preparing for the moment when patience becomes strategy. Through the viewport, she could see the Academy's bioluminescent towers pulsing with their eternal rhythm, beautiful and artificial against the star field. The galaxy's most prestigious institution of learning, where young minds came to study the universe's wonders while casually torturing the girl from the Deathworld. Maya smiled, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She was learning more. about galactic civilization than any of her classmates suspected, including weaknesses they didn't know they were revealing. Asterisk, asterisk. By the start of her second term, Maya had become invisible in the way that only the thoroughly dismissed can be. The other students had grown bored with their casual cruelty, settling into a routine of background harassment that they barely noticed anymore. She was simply part of the Academy's ecosystem, now the token human who absorbed abuse with primitive stoicism. Professor Zentkar had assigned a major research project, a comprehensive study of interspecies cooperation in academic settings. Most students chose to analyze historical data or conduct surveys. Maya chose to document her own experience. "Are you certain about this approach?" the professor asked during their consultation, his chromatophore shifting to colors that suggested professional concern. "Autobiographical studies are ... unconventional. And given your unique position here, it might be seen as provocative." Maya smiled politely. "I think it offers a valuable perspective on the dynamics of academic integration, Professor. My grandmother always said that the best way to understand a system is to watch how it treats its outsiders." She'd been collecting data for months, not just on the harassment, but on everything. Social hierarchies, power structures, communication patterns, cultural pressure points. Her ancient datapad was filled with observations that would have impressed military strategists, detailed psychological profiles of her tormentors, analyses of institutional blind spots, and a comprehensive map of how the Academy's civilized society actually functioned. The Geth nobility structure was based on ceremonial dominance displays. Crixif Ascending Flame's entire identity was built on his ability to demonstrate superiority over lesser beings. The Sharky operated through consensus building and environmental manipulation, using their technological advantages to create natural consequences for those who didn't fit their preferred social order. The Veldon Chorus collectives made decisions through harmonic resonance, literally voting by singing together, which meant that discord could be introduced through carefully calculated frequencies. Maya had learned to speak enough of each species, language to understand conversations that weren't meant for her ears. She knew about the betting pools, the scientific discussions of human psychology, and the increasingly elaborate plans to test her limits. What her tormentors didn't know was that she'd been testing theirs. During this period, she began to excel academically in ways that couldn't be ignored. Her research papers were innovative, her lab work was flawless, and her theoretical contributions were starting to gain attention from faculty members outside her immediate program. She was becoming valuable to the Academy's reputation, which made her harassment increasingly problematic from an institutional perspective. The administration's response was predictable. They began pressuring her to integrate better with her peer group. Maya was assigned to mandatory social activities, diversity workshops, and cultural sensitivity sessions, where she was expected to explain human behavior to students who had spent months studying her like a laboratory specimen. "Perhaps if you made more of an effort to understand galactic social norms," suggested Dr. Helix Prime, the Academy's counselor, during one of their required sessions. "Your isolation seems to be creating ... difficulties." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Dr. Helix Prime. I have been too focused on my studies. I should probably spend more time observing how civilized species interact." She'd been doing exactly that, but not in the way they imagined. Maya had begun sitting in on student government meetings, attending social functions, and volunteering for interspecies cultural exchanges. Everywhere she went, she listened, learned, and documented. Her research project was becoming something far more comprehensive than anyone suspected. The Academy's social dynamics were a perfect case study in institutional prejudice. The harassment wasn't random. It was systemic, predictable, and completely invisible to those who benefited from it. Maya had mapped every aspect of how the system worked, from the subtle environmental manipulations to the sophisticated social pressure that kept victims isolated and helpless. Her grandmother's stories had prepared her for this. Cherokee warriors had survived by understanding their enemies better than those enemies understood themselves. They'd learned to be patient, to gather information, and to wait for the perfect moment to act. That Maya was almost ready to act. She just needed her tormentors to make one more mistake, something big enough to serve as the perfect demonstration of everything she'd learned about galactic civilization. The opportunity came during the Academy's annual Integration Festival, a celebration designed to showcase successful interspecies cooperation. Maya had been assigned to present her research project during the academic symposium, with her presentation scheduled for the festival's final day. 3 years of work, documenting everything from her grandmother's oral histories to her own experiences. At the Academy, Crix the Sending Flame had been unusually interested in her project, asking questions about her data storage methods and backup procedures. Maya had answered honestly. Her entire research project was stored on her grandmother's old recording device, the same one where she'd been documenting her experiences in Cherokee. It was an antique by galactic standards, but it was the only piece of technology she owned that was truly hers. The week before the festival, Maya worked 18-hour days in the observatory, compiling her final presentation. Her research had evolved into something unprecedented, a comprehensive analysis of how Earth's ecosystem recovery principles could be applied to interspecies cooperation. She'd connected her grandmother's stories about Cherokee survival strategies with cutting-edge xenobiology, creating a framework for understanding how civilizations could not just coexist but thrive together. It was groundbreaking work that would have redefined several fields of study. It was also deeply personal, interweaving scientific data with family history and cultural knowledge that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. 3 days before her presentation, Maya returned to her dormitory to find Crix waiting for her with a small crowd of spectators. Her grandmother's recording device was in his claws, its casing cracked and its data core exposed. "I hope you don't mind," Crix said, his translator rendering his words with mock formality. "I was conducting a small experiment in human attachment behavior. Your primitive storage methods were fascinating to study." Maya stood perfectly still, watching 3 years of work disappear into fragments of memory and melted circuitry. The recording device wasn't just her research, it was her grandmother's voice, her family's stories, the last connection to the woman who'd raised her to understand that survival sometimes meant enduring what seemed unendurable. "I'm live streaming this to the Academy network," Crix continued, gesturing to the hovering documentation drones. "I thought it would be valuable for other students to observe authentic human emotional responses to loss. Your species' reputation for violence makes this particularly educational." The spectators watched with clinical interest as Maya knelt to gather the scattered pieces of her grandmother's device. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, but something had shifted in her expression, a change so subtle that only someone who knew her well would have noticed. "You know what, Crix?" Maya said, her voice carrying a quality that made several spectators unconsciously step backward. "You're absolutely right. You should study human responses. Let me show you what we call proportional escalation." She stood. Slowly, the broken pieces of her grandmother's device cradled in her palms. "This is my formal notification that I'm withdrawing from the Integration Festival presentation. I'll be submitting my research project through alternative channels." Crix's features arranged themselves into what passed for amusement among his species. Alternative channels? What could a primitive human possibly? "I'm also formally requesting a judicial review of Academy policies regarding systematic harassment of students from developing worlds," Maya continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd suddenly stopped pretending to be harmless. I have documentation of 347 separate incidents of discriminatory behavior over the past 3 years, including detailed analysis of the institutional structures that enable such behavior. The crowd had gone silent. Even the documentation drones seemed to hover more quietly. Finally, Maya said, her smile returning but carrying an edge that made the assembled students suddenly remember why her homeworld was called a Deathworld. I'm invoking Article 15 of the Academy Charter regarding academic fraud. You see, I've been conducting my own experiment for the past 3 years, studying how supposedly civilized species behave when they think nobody is watching. She turned to address the floating documentation drones directly. I hope you got all of that on record, because the real presentation is about to begin. The Academy's emergency tribunal convened within hours of Maya's formal complaints being filed. What they expected to find was a distraught student making wild accusations. What they discovered was a meticulously documented case study that exposed systematic institutional failure across multiple departments. Maya had spent 3 years not just enduring harassment, but cataloging it with scientific precision. Every incident, every witness, every administrative response that had classified cruelty as cultural differences or species compatibility issues. Her research project hadn't just been about Earth's ecosystems, it had been about the Academy's social ecosystem, analyzed with the same methodical approach her grandmother had used to understand Cherokee survival strategies. This is quite extraordinary, admitted Director Velson Harmony Eternal, the Academy's senior administrator, as Maya presented her findings to the tribunal. Though I must ask, if you had this documentation, why didn't you report these incidents when they occurred? Maya's smile was patient, almost grandmotherly. I did report them, Director. Every single incident was officially documented and classified as either cultural misunderstanding or species adaptation difficulty. Your own records show that the Academy's response was to recommend that I integrate better with my peer group. The tribunal's members exchanged glances that didn't require translation. They were beginning to understand that they'd been outmaneuvered by someone they'd dismissed as a primitive scholarship student. The pattern is quite clear, Maya continued, activating a holographic display that showed 3 years of data visualization. The harassment escalated in direct proportion to my academic success. When I scored in the top percentile on practical assessments, the equipment malfunctions increased. When my research gained faculty attention, the social isolation intensified. When I was assigned to mandatory integration activities, the harassment became more sophisticated and harder to prove. She paused, letting the implications settle. The Academy didn't just tolerate this behavior. It enabled it through systematic institutional blindness. Every report I filed was processed through bureaucratic channels designed to protect the institution's reputation rather than address the actual problem. Director Velson shifted uncomfortably. You're suggesting that the Academy's administration— I'm not suggesting anything, Maya interrupted. I'm documenting. This is a scientific analysis of how institutional prejudice functions in practice. The Academy markets itself as a model of interspecies cooperation, but the data shows that it's actually a perfect example of how civilized cruelty operates. The tribunal spent the next 6 hours reviewing Maya's documentation. Security footage that had been archived but never examined. Communication logs that showed coordinated harassment campaigns. Administrative records that revealed a pattern of dismissing complaints from students of developing species while fast-tracking concerns from the galactic elite. Crick's ascending flame and his followers had been so confident in their immunity that they'd barely tried to hide their activities. The betting pools were documented in official Academy communication channels. The environmental harassment was recorded in maintenance logs. The destruction of Maya's research project had been live-streamed to the Academy network as educational content. The most interesting finding, Maya concluded, is that none of this was personal. I was simply the most convenient target for behaviors that were already systemic. The Academy's prestigious reputation is built on the tolerance of institutional cruelty, as long as it's practiced by the right species against the right victims. The tribunal's judgment was swift and comprehensive. Crixith Ascending Flame was expelled and banned from all Academy-affiliated institutions. The administrative officials who had systematically ignored Maya's complaints were subjected to disciplinary review. The Academy's policies regarding student harassment were completely overhauled, with Maya's research methodology being adopted as the standard for identifying and addressing systematic discrimination. But Maya's real victory was subtler. Her research project, the one that had been destroyed, had never existed only on her grandmother's recording device. She'd been backing up everything to the Academy's own servers, using their institutional network to document their institutional failures. The destroyed device had been a decoy, containing only enough real data to make its loss genuinely painful. My grandmother taught me that the best way to defeat an enemy is to make them defeat themselves, Maya explained to the tribunal. She also taught me that data is only as valuable as your ability to protect it. I've been using the Academy's own systems to document the Academy's own failures for 3 years. That's not primitive thinking, that's strategic thinking. The final twist came when Maya was offered a full academic scholarship, administrative positions, and formal apologies from every level of the Academy hierarchy. She accepted the scholarship and declined everything else. I'm here to study xenobiology, she told Director Valsan. I've already completed my research on institutional psychology. The results are ... illuminating. Her presentation at the Integration Festival became legendary, not just for its scientific innovations, but for how it redefined the Academy's understanding of what civilization actually means. Maya had spent 3 years being dismissed as a primitive survivor from a Deathworld. She'd used that dismissal to conduct the most comprehensive study of galactic institutional prejudice ever attempted. The difference between her and her tormentors, she realized, wasn't that humans were more or less civilized. It was that, when humans decided someone needed to be stopped, they made sure to understand their enemy completely before acting. Maya graduated with the highest honors in Academy history. Her research on ecosystem recovery principles revolutionized 3 fields of study. Her documentation of institutional prejudice became required reading for administrative training programs across the galaxy. But the victory she treasured most was simple. She'd kept her grandmother's promise to show them what civilization really looked like. Sometimes it meant enduring what seemed unendurable. Sometimes it meant being patient enough to let your enemies teach you exactly how to defeat them. And sometimes it meant being from a death world where survival meant never giving up, never giving in, and never letting anyone mistake kindness for weakness. Asterisk.